Our next esteemed speaker is going to present a talk on the topic of yoga, Yoga Sutras, meditation. And he is Yogi Subhash Mittal. Yogi Subhash Mittal is the author of Pranayama, the elixir of life, and the founder of Integral Yoga. After working in the telecom industry for over 40 years, including both India and the US, Yogi Subhash Mittal decided to retire in 2005. In favor of pursuing his deep interest in yoga, he had completed his yoga teaching training in 1996 from the Swami Satchidananda Institute in Yogaville, Virginia. As time went by, he realized that he was deeply committed to learning more about yoga as well as teaching others so they could derive the benefits from their yoga practice. Currently, he devotes his time to studying yoga and also teaches several classes during the week.
I just want to make sure you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful.
Yes, Subhash.
All right. So thank you, Rubaya. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share some of the ancient wisdom of yoga with you all. So, what I'm going to do is to, mute everybody for now, and then I will welcome questions as we go along. Maybe that's a better idea. I don't know. We'll see. If it happens that the questions are too intrusive and time-consuming, maybe we'll leave the questions at the end. Okay. So, like Rubaiyat said, the topic is to understand the concept of yoga. And, when we hear the word yoga, for most people, the only thing that comes to mind is the practice of the physical asana practice or the physical postures, which are commonly presented, in most of the yoga classes, right? But then when we go back and look at some of the historical perspective on yoga, we realize that yoga is much, much more than just the physical aspect of yoga. So I'm going to take you through some of the concepts presented in an ancient text called the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Okay, so this is an ancient text, and this text is considered to be kind of the original text which gave us the concept of yoga. All right, so I'm going to go through a few presentation slides and just as a guidance, and then I'll share that slide with you just now. Let me just get to that slide. Where can I find it? Okay. I hope you can see this slide.
Yes, we can. It's clear. Thank you.
So, there are two main sources of yoga knowledge, which are commonly considered to be the main sources. And there are multiple sources otherwise, starting from the very ancient texts called the Vedas and Upanishads, and and then it goes on to many other texts. But the two key texts which are considered to be the most important for yoga knowledge, one is the Yoga Sutras by Patanjali, and the other is called the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. And this Yoga Sutras is roughly, there's no exact date known, it's roughly 2,500 years old, and it gives the the wisdom of yoga at a conceptual level. It doesn't have any practical or any practices mentioned in it. For practices of yoga, we go to the second book, what's called the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, and it's about, let's say, 800 to 1,000 years old. So it's not as ancient as the Yoga Sutras where Patanjali is. The Yoga Sutras itself is a collection of 195 statements. They are called sutras. And they are divided into 4 chapters. And the different aspects of the understanding of yoga is divided into 4 chapters. Okay. So I'm just going to go through a very small subset of the understanding that is presented in that text. All right. So let me just go first to the very definition of yoga that is presented by Patanjali. So in the very first chapter, Sutra number 2, what he says is that yoga, by definition, is the ability to suppress all the constant changes going on in the mind. What do we mean by constant change going on in the mind? Let me give you a very simple example. Okay, let's say I'm looking at something. I'm looking at an object, and I can pick a fruit, for example. My favorite fruit is mango. So let's say I'm looking at a mango. Okay. So when I'm looking at a mango, the image, a visual image of the mango is in my mind. Okay, that's the content of my mind at that moment. The very next moment, I may decide to pick up the mango with my hand. The moment I touch the mango, I have a sensation of touch of that mango in my mind. So as you notice, there's a sudden change that has happened. Within that change, also many other things can happen. My thoughts can come in. I might think of this another day when I had a mango, and that thought might be there in my mind. But then the idea is there's a constant change going on in the mind. And that change is known as vritti. That's the name given by Patanjali, vritti. Fluctuation, you can call it, change. Change of the content of the mind from one instance of time to the next instance is called a vritti. And it's happening all the time. And what yoga is defined here is the ability to subdue that constant change. That's the basic definition of yoga. Basically, all it's saying is that the yoga, by definition, yoga is the ability to calm the mind, keep the mind calm, irrespective of the situation that we are in. That's, at a very basic level, that's what it is. Okay, calm the mind. So, to understand how this mind functions and how to calm the mind, the commentators say that, okay, it's a good idea to think of the mind as a composite of 4 different functions. And they say the 4 functions, first is called the mind itself, manas in Sanskrit, which means the ability of the mind to receive input from the 5 senses. So the 5 senses are the ears, skin, eyes, tongue, and nose. So it's receiving input from the 5 senses, as well as the mind can direct the 5 sense organs, the hands, feet, speech, the organ of elimination, and the organ of procreation. So these are the functions of the mind, basically, getting involved with the outside world, both for receiving input and also directing output. And then there is the function called the intellect. There's another function called the ego, and we have memory. So the mind is mostly, it's the function, as I said, connecting with the outside world. Ego is the one function. It's called ahankara in Sanskrit, which is the kind of the I-ness. It's me, I, where it's an identity. I am so and so. I'm a father, I'm a student, I'm a teacher, I'm a co-worker, etc. So that identity is kind of defined by the ego, but if go much more beyond that, we'll talk about that. The intellect is the one function that makes determination. It's the determinative function, discriminatory function, which can decide or make decisions or make choices among different options that are available. Should I do this? Should I do that? Or, what are the different decisions that I can make, okay, based on whatever the input is received either by the mind or it can be pulled up through the memory. Okay, we can always think back, look at stuff that happened a few years ago, and then, we always have the ability to remember something from the past and become miserable, become angry, become guilty, and all that. We have that ability. Beautiful. That's what makes us miserable. All right. So that's the kind of the four functions of the mind. And as I mentioned, the main, the key thing to understand is that for most of us, at most of situations in life, the ego has become a fairly dominant player. Okay. And even though the intellect is supposedly the decision maker, but even the intellect, in many cases, is dominated by the ego. Okay. So I'm going to give you a quick example of how that is functioning. So let's say, I'm just giving this example here, knowing well that I have high levels of cholesterol, right? So my cholesterol levels are dangerously high. I'm a prime candidate for maybe some heart problem very soon. And, I have been advised by my dietitian that I should be avoiding things that can cause further damage, like sugar and fat. But then the ego is so strong that when I look at a piece of cake, I'm automatically driven to pick up that cake and eat it. Okay? Because what the ego says to the intellect is that, look, one piece of cake can do no harm. It's just one piece. Let's do it today. Let's enjoy this life today. We'll worry about it tomorrow. And then, of course, we know what the results are. Most of the time, they are disastrous. And that all that is happening because the ego is playing a very dominant role. Excuse me. Again, another example is based on my intellectual clarity. I decide to set up an alarm for 6 a.m., right? This happens very frequently. I teach yoga, for example, and after attending a program, I run different programs. Let's say they attend a 2-week program with me, and then they are really determined. Okay, from tomorrow, I'm going to wake up at 6 o'clock and do my yoga practice in the morning. So they set the alarm. So I set the alarm for 6 o'clock, and come 6 a.m., the alarm goes off. But however, driven by, and this guna tamas, we can talk about it later, but then the ego wakes up first, ego, okay, and it says, no, let's hit the snooze button, and we can, at least sleep for 10 more minutes. It's very comfortable under the covers, and we'll do that later. And what happens after that. This goes on every day, and the day never comes that you are actually practicing yoga. Okay, so this is how the whole mind functions. So the key thing to take away from here is that ego is playing a very dominant role in our life. It is subduing the intellect, and it is using the memory to play havoc with our life. Okay? Making us anxious, making us stressed out, making us all kinds of negative stuff happens. All right. So the purpose and the goal of yoga practice is eventually to somehow understand how to make this intellect much more stronger, much more powerful, so it is not driven by the ego. and it can make decisions which are actually driven by pure, you can call it intuitive wisdom. And that way, we can conduct our life in a manner that is the most efficient, most effective, most fruitful, most beneficial. Okay, so that's what the kind of the very high level of understanding how the mind functions. So, Patanjali has discussed many different aspects of our life in the Yoga Sutras. Okay, but to understand only one aspect, and I picked the aspect of, the word used in Sanskrit is dukkha. Dukkha means suffering of some kind. The most commonly used terms these days in modern terminology are stress, maybe anxiety, depression, all these negative feelings and thoughts which cause us pain and suffering. Okay, so when we look back, I also have looked at some of the Buddhist literature, and what they say is Buddha, there are 4 noble truths about Buddhism, right? So what Buddha said was that all is suffering. Basically, that's all he said. Everything in life is suffering. And the second one is there is a cause for the suffering. The third truth is that we can attain a state beyond suffering. And the fourth, of course, is how to get rid of that suffering. And in the Buddhism also there is a 8-fold path to remove suffering. Okay? The reason I'm mentioning this is that in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, he has also followed a very, very similar, almost identical approach to understand the concept of suffering. All right, so let's go through the concepts presented by Patanjali. Now, I'm mentioning the sutra numbers and all that, but we're not going to go through in any great detail, but to give you a feel for what Patanjali says, I've given these numbers, etc. And we'll go through these sutras one by one. So again, what he says, the Sanskrit word used is heyam. Heyam means that which should be and can be prevented, which is suffering, basically. Future suffering can be prevented. That's number one. Okay. First of all, he said there is suffering. So he says all is suffering. And then in the next sutra, he says, pain that has not yet come is avoidable. So future suffering, we can take care of. Okay, past suffering is gone. It's okay. Then he says that the cause of that avoidable suffering is the union of the seer and the seen. And I'm going to come to that briefly, okay, what that means. All right. And then there is a state which we can attain, which is free of suffering. That's called hanam in Sanskrit. Okay. So when we don't have that cause, which is causing the suffering, we avoid that cause or eliminate that cause, then of course we are free of that suffering. All right. And then what is the means of that attainment of that freedom from suffering? Okay. So this is again, he's talking about, kind of cleansing the mind, purifying the mind, so that we can get rid of all our ignorance, basically. So let's go through just a very, very brief understanding of what these are. Okay. So this is again, sutra number is given. When I say 2.15, it means chapter 2 and number 15. So here, what he's saying is that, look, once you start understanding life in some depth, you'll realize that pretty much everything in life is suffering. Everything leads to some level of suffering, not entirely, but some level of suffering. All right. And the reasons given are that, first of all, he said there is constant change going on in life. Everything is constantly changing. And that change results in suffering. We can look at life, right? When I say suffering, it's some kind of stress, some level of anxiety. Okay. A quick example, if I'm not married, I'm kind of anxious when I'm going to get married. When I'm married, I'm anxious. Oh, I'm going to deal with this whole married situation. Maybe there comes a point in life when I'm anxious. Oh, when can I get rid of this person? Things like that, right? Or, I don't have a job. I'm anxious when I'm going to get a job. When I get a job, I'm anxious how to deal with this job. When I lose my job, I'm anxious how I'm going to manage my life. Things like that. All I'm saying is, life is full of change, and change is a potential cause of suffering in some sense. Okay? Very common word, suffering, right? So then they say there are three kinds of suffering that we can go through. Suffering caused by other living beings. You can be, in the old days, they were living in the forest, so they were worried about wild animals, snakes, and all that. But these days, physical suffering is somebody slaps you, somebody shoots at you. That's all called physical suffering. And of course, there is suffering caused through mental anguish, worries, depression, anxiety. That's all self-created suffering. And of course, there is suffering caused by divine intervention. There are tsunamis happen, earthquakes, plagues, fire, etc. All right. Another very, very strong reason for suffering is past impressions. The Sanskrit word for that is samskara. Okay, so what that does, as I mentioned, the ego pulls up stuff from the memory, and all that is there in the memory is, I like this, I don't like it, I love it, I hate it, I want this, I don't want this. And all these attributes that are present in the memory, they either make us attached strongly to something, or they make us hate something very strongly. Okay, so there are strong likes and dislikes, hatred and love kind of relationships that we develop with everything in life. So all that is the cause of suffering. All right. And so what do we do? What's what Patanjali is saying here is that, look, we understand that there is suffering, but that pain that has not yet come is avoidable, preventable. Okay, we have the ability to eliminate future suffering, basically. But to get rid of the suffering, first of all, we have to understand what causes the suffering, right? So, what is this? What's the main cause? Why do we suffer? What's the main reason behind this? So he says that cause of that avoidable suffering is the union of seer and the seeing. Now, this is a very loaded sentence, and it needs a little more background as to what he's saying. And we probably won't have time to go into any depth of this, but at a very high level, let me just tell you in a few words. And I know it probably won't make it very clear, but we have to go back and understand that Patanjali based his philosophical concepts, which he presented in the Yoga Sutras, on another ancient philosophical system called the Sankhya philosophy. Samkhya, Sankhya philosophy. Okay. Now, as per that philosophy, there are two entities which are eternal. One is the pure consciousness. The term used for that is Purusha in Sanskrit, Purusha. Okay. And the other is the material nature, you can call it, material aspect of our being. So that's called Prakriti. So there is the pure consciousness on one side and Prakriti on the other side. They are both real and eternal. That's why this whole philosophy of yoga and Sankhya is called dualistic. Some of you have heard the terms dualistic and non-dualistic philosophies and all that. For example, Vedanta, has both dualistic and non-dualistic versions of Vedanta philosophy. Okay, and in this one, it's It's pretty much understood to be a very dualistic philosophy. But what happens is that because of ignorance, because of not knowing that my true nature is just nothing but this pure consciousness, I tend to identify myself with this Prakriti, which is nothing but my body, my mind, my thoughts, my emotions, my feelings, my intellectual capabilities. Okay, and that happens because of something called ignorance. Okay, so what he's saying is that, look, the main cause of this apparent union between the Purusha or the consciousness and the ego is this ignorance. What's ignorance? Ignorance is our inability to understand who I am, my true identity, my true reality. I am constantly identified with my body and my mind. My ego takes over, and that's why we have this situation where, in most cases, my ego is driving my actions, my thoughts, my feelings, my behavior patterns. And that's the cause of all suffering. That's the cause of all problems that we have in life. Because we want to transfer that dominance to the intellect. Okay, that's the whole idea. So he says that cause of that union is ignorance. Okay, and what can we do? So what, of course, then he says that we have to eliminate that ignorance so that we don't have this joining together, apparent union between the Purusha and Prakriti, the soul. Purusha is also the soul. That's the English term that you can use for Purusha is the soul, consciousness. So it's the apparent union that seems to be there between this pure consciousness or the soul and the non-conscious ego and the intellect, etc. Okay, so that's the whole idea. That's the whole practical aspect of yoga. That look, we want to attain that state where that union is now eliminated, basically. All right. So without this ignorance, no such union occurs. That's union between the soul and the ego. It doesn't occur. And that's called hanam, or removal of suffering, which leads to the independence or liberation of Purusha. That's what is called self-realization in some sense. Okay, you can use the term self-realization, because now I have realized my true self. That self then is spelled with a capital S. Okay, so that's the whole idea here, is to understand what's causing this suffering and how to eliminate this suffering. All right, so how do you do that then? How do you eliminate that ignorance? Then what he's saying is that you have to develop the Sanskrit word they use in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is viveka khyati. So uninterrupted discriminative discernment is the main means for its removal, the suffering, basically, of the ignorance that we have. What is discriminative discernment? That is the term which allows us to understand what my true reality is. That I am not, my current state of identification with my body and mind is the falsity, is not true. It's an apparent understanding, apparent connection between the two. I need to remove that connection. And when I develop that discriminatory wisdom, then I'm free, then I'm liberated. Okay, so that's the whole idea here. All right, to develop that discriminatory wisdom so that I can understand the importance of this concept where I can now separate myself from this whole mind-body complex. All right. So, so this is what the basic theme of the Yoga Sutras is in terms of understanding why we have all the suffering in life and what we need to do. So now what Patanjali says that, look, I've given you the background to what suffering is all about. The conceptual understanding is there now. But then what do? How do you get rid of all this? Then he presents this, what is called, very commonly known as 8 limbs of yoga. 8 limbs of yoga. So this is what he's talking about now. What he says is that by the practice of these 8 limbs of yoga, the impurities of the mind go away and we can see the light of wisdom. And this process continues. Some impurities will go away. We'll see a little more light. This light is covered by the ego in general. In general, we don't have access to this light of wisdom because ego has such a strong hold on us. We have no idea what that light means. Okay, so we just keep going back and forth in our life without understanding there is, this light of wisdom. Okay, so this constant, this sequence goes on. Some impurities will go away and the light of wisdom will shine through. When we say impurities, again, what do we mean by mental impurities? The basic idea is to understand that, look, we have all kinds of negativities in our mind. That's the impurities, right? Things like, even what we just talked about, stress, anxiety, depression, and then all the negative emotions like anger, jealousy, hatred, greed, you can name it, so many things, guilt feelings, okay? All those are impurities in the mind which take a strong hold on us because of the dominance of the ego, okay? So what he's saying is that by the practice of these 8 limbs of yoga, we can start eliminating these impurities and start seeing the light of wisdom. And when this process continues for a long enough time, then we can get to this discriminative discernment, or viveka khyati, the same word that was used earlier, which means we have now the wisdom to realize who we truly are, not identified with my mind, body, and the intellect. Okay, so what are the 8 limbs of yoga? So the 8 limbs of yoga are listed here. They are yama, niyama. I'm just going to go through the list very quickly. Asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. All right. So these are the Sanskrit names for these 8 limbs of yoga. Yamas, each of these are 5, and I'm going to give you very briefly the list here. Yamas are mostly like our social interaction with others. Niyamas are mostly related to ourselves, self-discipline, you can call it. Asana is the physical seated posture. Pranayama is all the breathing practices. Pratyahara is the ability to withdraw any influence from the 5 senses so that the mind is not distracted by the 5 senses. And then, of course, there are the 3 stages of meditation. One is called dharana, initial focus and concentration. Dhyana is the actual meditation. And finally, samadhi, which is the final state of our total absorption, you can call it. Okay? So these are the building blocks. You can say the yamas and niyamas are the building blocks for our yoga, or yogic life, way of life. So what are these? Okay. So let me just list the 5 yamas. So these are 5 yamas, okay? So this is ahimsa, which is non-injury, not non-violence, it's called, non-hurting, okay, not causing hurt to others or to yourself. Truthfulness, not stealing. Then brahmacharya is, you can call it continence or sexual control, they call it And then aparigraha is non-hoarding, not having greediness. That's the 5 yamas. Like I said, they kind of involve interaction with others, okay? And then we have the 5 niyamas, which is more on self-discipline. First one is cleanliness of the body and the mind. Then santosha is contentment, being contented with what we have. It doesn't mean we don't strive for things, but be happy, be contented with whatever we get as a result of our endeavors, our actions. The third is austerity, tapas. Number 4 is self-study. And number 5 is surrender to God, basically. All right, so these are the 5 niyamas. Now, I'm going to skip through all this, basically, because the whole idea is that, let me just get rid of this share now. I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes of discussion now. So what Patanjali says that, look, if you practice these 8 limbs of yoga, your mind will get more and more purified, cleansed, okay, of all the negative stuff that you have. And when that happens, then you can have a much better control of what you think, what you do, how you behave in society, etc., etc. So basically, not the ego, but your pure intellect is in the driver's seat, okay? And to do that, eventually, he says, the most important tool in our hands is meditation. So, when we look at the practice of yoga, there are 3 practical aspects, which is asana, pranayama, and meditation. Asana is the physical posture. Pranayama is the breath control, breathing practices. Most people tend to practice them in this order. They first practice asana, then pranayama, then meditation, okay, which is fine. But from the point of view of importance, priority is the reverse order. Number 1, importance and priority is for meditation. Number 2, for pranayama, breathing practices. And number 3, for the physical aspect of yoga, which is asana or the physical postures. I emphasize this only because most people, when you think of the word yoga, all they think of is the physical posture. Most people, okay? Unless you, of course, you've studied all these concepts and all that. All right, so that's the main message that Patanjali wants to give, that look, meditation becomes your main key approach to the practice of, to your life, basically. You have to make it a life, like a part of your daily life. And then slowly and slowly that impurities go away, mind becomes clean, you're able to think very clearly, you're able to focus much better, you're able to manage your time better, you sleep better, you eat better, life gets better. Okay. If that's the goal, if that's what you want, if that's what you're looking for in life, please absolutely begin to meditate. Okay. What's meditation? Very simplistically, is to focus your mind on a single object. Okay. It could be anything. The most common object that people have found over the years is called a mantra. So pick a mantra and recite that mantra in your mind. And, the idea is to continuously repeat that mantra in your mind. Of course, thoughts will come in. But the moment you recognize that a thought has taken over the mind, go back to the mantra recitation. That's it. That's meditation. All right. I'm going to stop here because I think my time is up. I would be very happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Thank you so much, Subhashji. So I'd like to invite the audience to ask questions, share thoughts. You're most welcome to do so.
Subhash, this is a second. When it comes to meditation, do you recommend certain duration of meditation, or it is the status of the mind that dictates the duration?
Well, initially you have to kind of set your mind that, look, I'm going to, allocate a certain amount of time, because otherwise the mind is so restless. After 5 minutes, you're going to say, oh, no, I can't do that. I'm going to get out of this meditation. But if you have to, if you initially set a time duration, maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes, okay? And then, of course, once you're there, then your mind is set. Then you set the intention, it's called a sankalpa, and that way you'll be able to allocate that time and stay for that time.
Okay, thank you. Do you recommend certain type of meditation, or
Like I said, my own practice is mantra meditation, and that's what I teach, and that's what I recommend. But there are other styles of meditation. Mantra meditation is powerful because it gives you a support, it's kind of a gadget to hang on to.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question about the 8 limbs of the yoga.
Uh-huh.
They are instructions for the yoga meditation. Are they also instructions for daily life when there is continuous meditation, or is it a separate, is the specific instruction for the practice and not for the daily life?
Well,
Thank you.
Okay, so the idea is, when you have to initially, as a beginner, okay, when you're beginning the practice of yoga, it's a good idea to allocate a certain amount of time. It's an iterative process. So you will go through meditation, asana, pranayama, and meditation on a regular basis. What that does is, when your mind becomes clean, when your mind becomes pure, then the final state, which is called samadhi, then you're constantly in that state of samadhi during the day. Then that becomes your natural state. So then it is a question of, you are in a state of samadhi all the time, basically. What that means is that when you're not driven by the ego, okay, then you are always doing the right thing, or making the right decisions, or thinking very clearly, etc. So in that sense, you're always in that state of meditation. But as a beginner, you have to allocate a certain amount of time so that you can develop that practice. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful.
Do we have any more questions for Subhash Mittal ji? If you can't think of any now, you're most welcome to leave it in the comment section for those of you who are watching us on social media. And the ones here with us on Zoom, you can leave your questions in the chat. I will have access to them, and I can send them to Subhash ji and collect his answer and send it back to you. Thank you so much. Subhash ji, once again, thank you so much. I'm so very grateful to you. Thank you for gracing us with your presence and that wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Good to be here.